Welcome to the lecture this evening. We'll be starting now. Sorry for the late beginning. My name is Tim Durfee. I'm on the design faculty here at SCI-Arc and the coordinator of the Soft Technology Visual Studies program at SCI-Arc. In the philosophical parlor game of ranking the arts, a 19th century obsession, thinkers like Schopenhauer invariably put architecture dead last. During Schopenhauer's time, the earliest dawnings of modernism in the beginning of the 19th century in Europe, referentiality and utility were understood as impure, hastening the beginnings of abstraction and atonality in art and music. With modernism, architecture famously broke away from diachronic referentiality. Today, in this postmodern period, we see two prevailing legacies to this insecurity architecture has with reference. To be painfully reductive, there is the box on one side, which is essentially a reference to non-reference. Then there's the architecture by architects for whom geometry itself is hopelessly old school. Clearly, technology is the catalyst for this debate, such as it actually exists as a debate. One argument for the box is, don't make form itself the subject of architecture. One argument for the more supple stuff is that form is the subject of architecture, and if technology opens up new directions, we are obliged to go there. Our speaker this evening is having it both ways. Why not deflect the singular indulgence of form for its own sake by maintaining the presence of what is at some level the value-free objective language of modernism, while at the same time exploiting the incredible potential of new technology and what it has to offer for the construction of actual space. Because of this, the architecture Bill Massie creates using state-of-the-art techniques calls one's attention not just to the thing itself, but to its effects. Light raking across a curved rather than flat surface, or the pore holes and seams of cast concrete. If Schopenhauer were alive today, I'm sure he would approve, and maybe even raise architecture up a notch or two. Please join me in warmly welcoming William Massie. Sorry.
That was very nice. Thank you. Thanks for staying here. I think everyone's a kind of captive audience. I'm going to talk about some hybrid technology, and I was just noticing this kind of amphibious vehicle earlier on television. It was fairly interesting and prophetic. I'm going to talk about some issues that underpin the work that I'm trying to do. But I'm also going to talk about the work kind of specifically. The issues hopefully will be, in a way, totemic. They're these kind of ideas that continuously run through the work, mostly, and I'm not going to bore anyone with something that I've been doing lately, which is to splice kind of these ideas and try to reference or quote them directly from Marshall McLuhan, and I'm not going to do that tonight, so you're all the benefactors of me not doing that. I'm going to talk about an idea of speed, an idea of remote making, variation and repetition, the model as an idea of scale, and also the model most currently in my office, this idea about verification. And verification through the use of the tools. You'll see towards the end of this, I also decided that this would be the longest lecture that I ever gave, and because I've got a lot of stuff. So I think it's probably not the right night to do that. So what I'll do is I'll go through things very, very rapidly, but I will, towards the end, kind of pause at just some images of some steel work that we've done as a way of discussing the importation, or basically the kind of importing of the tool into panelization. Something I'm more obsessed with at a kind of smaller scale than concrete at the moment. But the idea that in fact, I've shown this slide many times before, and I can't kind of get over it. It's mostly because I like this guy's hair. That in 19th century technology, the idea, it was just a kind of dumb but brilliant idea that in fact, if you look at the back of this image, one roller would produce one crimp and then ultimately you'd have 12 rollers, 12 segments to 12 crimps to develop a kind of corrugated material. But it's in a sense one machine doing one thing very, very well, kind of exquisitely engineered and developed. But it is only kind of one operation, a kind of singular operation. Something that I'm very interested in is this idea of singular operation relative to kind of current state-of-the-art technology like computer numerically controlled machining and or laser cutting, LOM, stereolithography, water jet cutting, those kinds of things, where I think there's a kind of huge potential to understand this in a certain way, literally as a tool to develop a kind of richer spatial kind of environment. When it's evidenced in these B-52 bomber nose cones, when you look at the actual precision and non-variation of not only the nose cones but also the placement of the nose cones, and they're spanking clean. But what's actually going on is they're mapping the interior of the space that they're actually in relative to the kind of lighting above. Each one is a single condition that's supporting a relationship, a kind of complex relationship of where they are versus what they are. I'm going to talk probably in two specific projects about this subject-object relationship, and that's where I think my phone is still on too. But this kind of subject-object relationship that Marshall McLuhan talks a great deal about, or did, I guess. And I'm going to talk about certain ideas of landscape relative to that. And notions also about complexity, but attempting to render them render a kind of complex condition simply. Just the idea also of forming, and all of this kind of bled through I hope, a critique of the typical bifurcation of design and then making, or design and fabricating. In my studio, when I was going to graduate school, I had this little commercial space, and unlike all of you in this really amazing building, I didn't have great studio space, and I had a shop. I had my own shop, but then I also had a kind of drawing surface which was able to kind of weather construction inside. Let me go back inside my space. It was a kind of machine for studying architecture for me. Scott Inge, who's here, I think tonight, helped me steal all of that steel from a construction site and weld it one evening. This is years and years ago, but this kind of typical bifurcation between what one draws or what one actually is kind of abstracting to the actual construction is obviously one of the components of this computer numerically controlled technology, which is fascinating to me. The idea that we can go directly from some kind of abstract stimulus to built form, mostly as a matter of efficiency, mostly as a way of rendering spatial condition in actual in actual space. I mean, essentially we can simulate so beautifully in the computer, but this idea that the computer is in fact a way of sampling and or a way of transferring information, filtering information. Ultimately, the goal to me though is the actual. And is a kind of supplemented actual space. I don't know exactly when this was, but a few years ago, some people at Johns Hopkins University were studying a foot, a kind of common foot, as a way of getting at a bad back, understanding back problems. So I've shown this before as well, but I wanted to show that essentially what happened was 1,000 feet, and obviously not in a linear way, but 1,000 human feet were kind of scanned. Maybe it's 2,000 because of the right and left thing, but I don't know. But these feet were scanned, and in fact, the arch of 1,000 people with good backs was looked at, and then it was moved directly from their feet, averaged, and then produced as a kind of insole. It's fascinating because the idea of that arch, the kind of curvature relating to something else and not actually being manipulated by hand, but rather just sampled, like one might sample a certain kind of rhythm track and then lay something else on top of it. You'll see that hopefully some of the work that I'm doing seems somewhat improvisational, and it's mostly not because of the technology, but the position of our office relative to the technology, which is that we can actually make things. We make things that are the size and the scale and the kind of materiality of buildings, and this is more and more what's going on. I don't have a machine like this. This is just a really pretty one. It's very, very expensive. That's why I don't have one of these. But it's a computer numerically controlled milling machine. I am gonna kind of skip through some things. Otherwise, we will be here quite some time. It's this was just really to introduce an idea of this kind of subject-object. It was a competition in which I can't resist. I have to go back real quick. It was a competition that I didn't win, or I was actually disqualified, which is better than losing. But I was disqualified because I interpreted the rules of the Battle of Little Bighorn competition as thickness versus actually drawing. So I for myself thought, it said no models, but I thought, well, I could just machine in kind of a bas relief the boards for the actual presentation, and they of course disqualified me based on that idea. But that was the idea of the memorial that I was designing. There was also this idea of imprint and Native American women beadwork too, and I'm not going to go into those things right now. But on the back of the board, there was a disc, and it said, and it was taped with an envelope, and it said, if in fact you choose this project, all you have to do is take this disc and insert it using a Como CNC machine and 2-pound rigid foam. And then you can just make the memorial. You can make the monument, and so that's actually what I tried to do, which was I tried to actually build it in a kind of virtual job site or kind of in digital space first. It was completely constructed and then just prepared in a kind of remote way. Whenever it wanted to be built, it could be machined out. It was to be machined out of 2-pound density foam and then cast with concrete. So they wouldn't even, the idea for the boards was in fact that these boards were not, they were not presentation boards, but they were actual surfaces that I clipped on in the actual memorial. Those surfaces that I clipped on, I then brought into one form and then machined out the boards, so that the boards were in fact samples of the actual, but the actual had not been produced yet. That was the whole thesis of the project. But this thing with a horse and an arrow won, which was, it was actually pretty cool in a perverse way. Anyways, one thing that happened was this kind of corduroy concrete that I was experimenting with. This is when you machine 2-pound density foam as fast as you possibly can, it's kind of like low DPI. We don't even talk about DPI or dots per square inch anymore in terms of printing. So I mean, ultimately, this is kind of like low DPI, and I've been using this kind of low DPI technique to produce forms for concrete because they're very, very rapid and very, very inexpensive. A project that I also won't go into at all is this wall that I kind of printed sectionally, where I abstracted these ideas of a form tie, and then was able to produce a wall which curved in 2 directions. I won this research award, this PA research award with this project. It was like $1,000. I had $1,000 to do it. And the idea was I could produce a wall which, because of its curving in 2 directions, it had a certain amount of diaphragmatic strength. It could actually increase its strength by 30 times using the same amount of material. And this, obviously, from the trash on the ground, you can see it's not really a kind of sustainable notion based on the formwork, but hopefully a kind of more sustainable idea based on the reason potentially to make curvature. Ultimately, from the first computer model, but to just the simple little wall that I kind of printed out of concrete, the idea was, in fact, to hold light, which becomes this kind of catalyst for the first project that I'll talk about relative to 3 specific projects, all 3. Hopefully might I don't know, maybe it will be a critique in a way of my relationship to the introduction. I think that was too nice. The first project is really about a kind of merging with the landscape, or kind of I hate to even use the term, but the kind of morph, the kind of merging or blending with the landscape. The second project is really more about the subject-object relationship, and marking the landscape. And then the third one is quite specifically about the kind of not post-modernist relationship, but the kind of modernist charge of just ignoring the landscape completely, and by virtue of doing that, you've developed something wonderful. It's also the way my wife and I argue, somehow. This is a site in Montana. This is the property. That's the site right there. This is a house called the Big Belt House. This is my house. It's not really 100% done yet. Hopefully it's going to be done in July. And I was able to use a very expensive global positioning system survey, a GPS survey, which ended up was like 1/4-inch resolution, which cost like $6,000. And I had gone to Bozeman, Montana to teach and to buy some property to try to execute a building. That was the big idea. And so I bought this property in that place, which you can see is absolutely extraordinary. If for those of you who have not been to Montana, the relationship of the kind of size of the ground, it seems, and the light is extraordinary. The whole idea about big sky country is much more than an idea. But at any rate, what I did was I took a GPS survey and I basically mapped the foreground and background topographies of the site. I chose a place by watching the snow drift for that winter in a place where the building could sit, where it wouldn't be inundated with snow. Obviously, that was a kind of myth, because once I placed the building there, then it changed all of that relationship, which was very interesting anyways. But the idea that it actually sat inside the kind of foothills of the Big Belt Mountains. This is the site of the second project I'll show you as well. The program is the only program that I've done at all under my own kind of authorship, except for the stuff that you won't see, which is to make to make money. There's some contract interiors deep in my past, like, I don't know. The building kind of hugs the landscape, and the kind of foreground and background topographies were in fact the main and primary geometry that I started to use to make kind of enclosure. They were obviously negotiated with structure and structural condition, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the idea for the building was a notion of visual rhyming. I mean, I don't really know how to define that specifically, except for if one says, and then being in Los Angeles and the new movie coming out already, Cat in the Hat. But if you say cat and hat, there is, just by the juxtaposition of those two words, the fact that they audibly rhyme develops a relationship which is a little bit more developed than two words that don't rhyme. This was the idea. That's all there was about this building, which was, how could I develop a building that visually rhymed with landscape? If you looked at the hill and or the foreground or background topography, could I actually develop a relationship based on the precision of the information which was about that was offered by the GPS mapping, which I just this is. I'm not going to talk about this, but I just gave a lecture, a little talk about the idea, the kind of death of cartography, and the notion that with 24 satellites, the idea that the map is kind of rendered fairly insignificant in a certain way. It's actually, the map, to my mind, it seems to be really only about the communication of events versus literal distance. I mean, when you drive, I just got a new car, but I didn't. I got a Mini, and I hate in the Mini, I hate the large speedometer, and so I was going to spend the other $1,500 to get GPS, but I couldn't afford it. But effectively the idea that one can drive anywhere in North America and information as to where you are becomes completely available all the time. The idea of planning and the idea of improvisation becomes very, very much a criticism of the idea of mapping, to my mind. The Big Belt house, the house that I'm talking about, was kind of developed in whatever way we could. We cast to actually test the structure. I couldn't get anybody to run the numbers effectively. I didn't have any money. That was one thing. But and then number two, no one really was capable. I just didn't know the right people, quite frankly. I know there are many people who are very capable of doing that. But what we did in lieu of knowing those people was to cast buckshot, lead buckshot into silicone rubber, which, you know, any excuse to do something like that anyways is worthwhile, to simulate snow load. So we built physical models in buckshot and rubber and put them on air-impregnated PVC models, big models, and looked at the deformation. You'll see the building is kind of these portal frames of concrete. Each time we poured one, we literally poured an 8-foot section from point to point, but some of them are about 30 feet wide, about 26 feet wide, and we did a continuous pour of what I call kind of portal frames, and it's a direct, I guess it's spatial organization, a kind of rip-off of one of my favorite buildings, which is here. Most of my favorite buildings are in Los Angeles, but by Rudolf Schindler, the Lovell Beach House. The idea that we could kind of produce in a computer model sections, and those sections could then be actually resectioned, sliced up further, and continue to be deconstructed into boards, basically tool paths for a computer numerically controlled milling machine, which you know, besides the GPS survey, which was the second thing that broke the budget on the building, we cut this up virtually, and then actually started to fabricate all of the 2-pound density foam, which was recycled and, you know, has become coffee cups somewhere. We power washed it and then lied to the company and said, no, we just broke it up. We never touched it. So it's coffee cups somewhere else. And we had to lie so that it could be recycled. But the idea was that we would have no construction documents at all. I didn't want to have any construction documents, which was the stupidest thing that I've ever done in my life. We look like kind of 19th century photographers with towels over our heads looking at 2 laptops. It was really very comical and really stupid. For about 4 months until this happened over 2 summers. For the first summer, after that, then that winter we produced documents and, you know, kind of laminated them so that they wouldn't, you know, because the building wasn't still enclosed, so we needed the drawings to actually be waterproof. But at any rate, we were able to produce 2-pound density rigid foam forms to be able to pump and cast concrete into these forms. I experimented with a great deal of off-the-shelf form ties that were coupled with machining. We ultimately went with our own form tie that we made ourselves, because we realized that if we could place the form tie in exactly the correct position, we could use this foam, which is very, very lightweight, and you can push your thumb through it, but we were pumping 18 inches of concrete overhead and not having the forms blow out, but it was basically based on the fact that the form ties were so evenly distributed, and they weren't 5 1/4 inches between each one, and they would vary up to a 1/2 inch. They were within, you know, 1/2 of a 64th of an inch, dead on, because it was all so accurate. But that accuracy it wasn't really a kind of fetishism of the accuracy. It was really rather, if we can spread the load out, we know that in fact we can actually achieve it, and we can achieve it for very, very, very little in terms of the cost of the material. The other thing that became clear when I really did not want to have construction documents was this idea of the puzzle piece. This is the kind of this idea or this notion of importing the tool into the panel, literally making pieces go together that can't fit a different way. So the intelligence of the office, in a way, is used when it's freezing cold and it's raining and things and there's confusion. The idea of making things go together rapidly is extraordinarily significant. Really incredible find, foam welding. This is just a simulation without the landscape, moving up to the building. The kind of yellow surface in the front and on the back is this kind of foreshortening idea that when you drive up on the highway, when you drive up to the building, you see there's one plane that's like 70 feet, 78 feet in back of the other one. So because the building is kind of curving subtly all over the place, these two rectilinear to me, they're kind of flags. They're kind of clarification devices. I didn't want it to be camouflage. I wanted it to be this rhyme, but it took these yellow surfaces in a way to make sure that it always read as a kind of mark in the landscape as well. This is just the construction after the first summer, and that's how it stood. That winter, I was teaching at Montana State, and that winter I went back to New York and I saw a show by Toshigeru Bond, and he was building these surfaces and these buildings, quite obviously beautiful and amazing stuff, out of paper tubes, and it was bound and it looked very much like bamboo. And so I thought, what is the American version of bamboo? And of course that's PVC pipe. So I had designed the infill out of stress skin for this building, and there was no money to do it, and I was experimenting as well with and being fascinated with the idea that these tubes could mediate compound curvature, could actually in fact bend in two directions. It's the only structural, the kind of section modulus that over its length wants to be able to bend kind of diplomatically in two directions to kind of be able to understand the nuance of this curvature. Because when I know that this looks really, the geometries look kind of very gratuitous, but the idea is that when you drive up to the building and as approach to the building, you see the building matching 7 different kind of topographical conditions between 100 feet away and 200 miles away, or as far as you can see, and it does work. So when you drive up, I mean, if you have a couple of drinks, it works much better, but it does work. I mean, I can see the relationship of the computer model, the actual landscape, the kind of attempt at making landscape. I can see those relationships when I go up to the building. But the PVC pipe was there's 21 or 25,000 linear feet of PVC pipe, and that was like $6,000. It was great, but it did allow the curvature. The building, because it was retrofitted, the whole building kind of got fatter by 4 inches ultimately, because this was all on the outside versus the infill panels were to be on the inside. But the price difference was, the cost for me was like $60,000, which that was all the reason to do it. Once that was actually happening, there was somebody came up out to the job site and thought that it was a really terrific idea. I was trying to quickly, shotcrete it with concrete so nobody knew how crazy this was. But somebody thought it was actually a good idea and hired me to do a building in which then we studied that relationship. Instead of it being really a retrofit condition, we looked at two-directional curvature being a byproduct of tube structure, and this is something that's kind of ongoing research as well. The way we, in this project, the way we kind of held the surfaces together were through laser cut steel. Actually, this is plasma cut steel. This is kind of a little commercial. This is not the Big Belt House. This is this next project that I was talking about. I'm not going to really talk about this building at all, except for one thing, which is that through the making of these puzzle pieces, through our office actually just being responsible for every piece of material that gets made, more and more we're not really making parts, but what we're doing is we're choreographing work. We now understand that that's really what we're doing. We're actually modeling the conduit of all of the electrical and basically all the returns of plumbing and everything else on our projects that are all houses, as a way of being able to produce jigs and fixtures which locate all of those things in space. So we are not actually producing drawings that have numbers. We're producing drawings that have sequences. And what we're doing is kind of thinking about construction and construction documentation being based on choreography versus versus kind of legal documents. For instance, this whole building. I'm sorry, it's not letting me go back. There's a steel jig that we laid down on the ground. This is an Alaskan reinforced concrete slab. It's thickened to 20 inches at the edge and about 5 inches thick in the center. It's all radiant floor slab. But what we did is we made a steel jig that located every bolt, every plumbing riser, all of the location of the radiant tubing, and then as well this kind of thing affectionately that we called this kind of caterpillar that actually located the edge. We also laser cut out the tool that would bend that precisely so that in fact the edge would go together. Obviously, one can't. You can put numbers to all of these geometries, but in fact, it's easier not to put numbers and just to develop it. And it's all these things are kind of mitigated by this idea of the puzzle and the idea, the kind of critique of 19th century construction relative to that one image that I showed of one roller producing one thing. If you think about how we dissect really every building material up until 5 years ago, obviously the construction or the aerospace industry and the auto industry, product industry, way ahead, but in terms of actual panelization and or typical building materials, we think about cutting them with one or two devices. One maybe being a drill press. You can push holes into these panelized materials, and another one might be a saw. But typically, because of linear production, basically a saw cuts in one direction. Even if it's a jigsaw, it has a bias towards doing things in one direction. But once you couple computer numerically controlled machining, it doesn't take, there's no added cost except for time to make this right here, this cut. Effectively, if that takes 1 second, if it were a straight cut, it took 1 second, and it takes 1.002 seconds, then it's 0.002 seconds that you're actually paying for. But the 0.002 seconds says when it's on the site, this cannot go together with another piece in a different way. This will snap together and actually fixture itself temporarily until it's welded. Obviously, if that were a straight cut too, the relationship of this curvature would all be off if one positioned it off. So what we're trying to do is, instead of describe to someone else the energy that it takes for an architect to describe to someone else, to communicate legally as well as as well as philosophically and kind of scientifically describe something to someone else. What we're trying to do is to take that energy and to place it into the notion of choreographing a building. That's why this whole the ideas of prefabrication and prefab, I really don't think about them the same way as I think other people think about them. I'm thinking about the kind of digital space as being the place of prefabrication and prefabrication. But of course, that's what I think documentation in terms of architecture always has been. So it's just a kind of compression of that. If we go back, you can see that everything on the slab, there's just nothing else in this building except for the slab in a way. So all of the electrical, all the plumbing's in the slab, everything is. No building codes in Montana. That's why I moved there. And then the kind of commodification of that idea by literally producing plasma cut jigs that just hold and script the PVC pipe in one position, and that one position is easy. In fact, it is the more conventional components of the building took much longer than the unconventional components of the building. The actual kind of weaving of this, because of the office that we are and everything else, happened until like 11 o'clock at night in one day. It was we built the whole building. Once it was, we just get so excited that can't not do the work. And so the kind of more unconventional components were a little bit easier. This is back to the big built house, and this is this kind of concrete board cladding, which I've subsequently torn off. It was something to just kind of weather the building in, and that's actually going to be changed this summer. In Montana, obviously there has to be some kind of thermal break, because then if there wasn't the concrete, the building is fundamentally concrete, but it's mediated by some stress gain panels at the edge, so that there's a kind of thermal break between all the concrete, because the building is radiantly heated, and if it were that cold, it would just suck the heat right out via the concrete and obviously transmit the cold back in. It's also mediated by we cast all of the mullions out of an amber rubber that somehow I put myself through graduate school at Columbia University by casting things, and so that still kind of continues. The fascinating thing about that, though, was in fact that if we were able to do that, what could happen is we could produce these rubber mullions that this is a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking here relative to the idea of visual rhyming, but and I know that it's kind of a trendy color, I guess. But the idea that this amber rubber once a day matched the color of the landscape, which in Montana it does once a day, because the sun goes below basically, even if they're clouds, and rakes horizontally across surface, it gets this kind of orange, the kind of orange reddish color of the landscape. But the thing that was fascinating was that in the place where you might have mitigated or stopped light because the actual mullion, in a way, that is a gasket, effectively, it allows light to pass inside the wall versus being held at the surface of the wall. Different than kind of like a butt connection or something where glass is trying to be rendered as nothing. In fact, this is kind of, it highlights, and under different light levels. This is a kind of tattoo, a kind of, that's just the surface. Obviously, that's just a surface imprint of the concrete, and they're obviously all over the building. But changing from a very high light to low light outside, when it's raining and everything else, then actually at the edge of all of the concrete, surfaces kind of are illuminated. I'm doing a house for someone in Red Hook, New York right now. I'm not going to show that project by Greg Wooten, and the house is kind of based on this edge luminant condition. We're doing it in a totally different way. It's really, I'm so proud of this curtain wall that we're fabricating. It's very, very cheap and very, very beautiful. It's completely illegal, but really strong. I mean, you know, very, 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 very strong. I mean, and I don't mean that's not illegal. You know, it's like, it's not illegal at all, quite frankly. It's just that people within the building department don't understand it. This kind of corduroy concrete, and maybe the relationship of the light is a little bit Monday morning quarterbacking, but I was definitely trying to make surfaces which were much more about the kind of soft nature of the landscape, so that when you were bathing or washing your hands or something, there would also be that relationship, a kind of clear relationship to the landscape. I'm going to skip over some of the kind of more, the kind of mold making and that kind of thing, and talk about, I'll probably just kind of move on to the next project. This is the way the Big Belt House sits now. Not quite finished, but hopefully this summer. The next project, if that one was kind of about merging with the landscape, this one is more about marking the landscape. A house very, very close to the Big Belt House. In fact, as a crow flies, about just less than a half a mile away. But I convinced the clients who were in Montana, who they were in Montana for the same reasons I was. I mean, they didn't hike. You know, they're not like healthy or anything. They didn't like ride bicycles or exercise or fish or shoot animals or anything. They just were there because they liked the way the light kind of struck surface, and it's very true. They really just liked the way the light raked across the landscape and how beautiful the landscape was. So after a few cocktails on our first meeting, I came up with this idea that I could hopefully produce a second sunset, because Montana has these amazing sunsets every day, it seems, and by lighting the building and bouncing light off of curved surfaces on the inside, I would allow at noon this same kind of humming light based on painted surfaces inside the building. Once I said that I'd produce a second sunset, I got the job. Didn't really work quite that way. But, there was another reason that to develop this building based on the landscape, which was this kind of subject-object relationship. And I won't go into the kind of McLuhan references based on all of that, but the idea that the property, the thing that was so fantastic is it sat at the end of 6 miles of straight highway. But what's so interesting was that the highway was straight, and at the point that it kind of visually dead-ended into their property, it cranked and ran down into this basically a kind of gorge, all to avoid two things: this very, very large mountain called Mount Edith, and basically all of this topography. The idea was that this was the subject, the actual highway was the subject, and the mountain was the object. The highway was there, obviously, to avoid the object. So there was this clear landscape dialogue that already was there. And so the building, these are simulations from the same, we were able to double our money and use the same computer model. That was another way to convince them, which was I could do something very, very precise. And place their building in the landscape and know precisely where it is, because I wanted to develop this relationship, which was really about marking and measuring the landscape. It turned out that we had to kind of bulldoze the earth to the tune of about $12,000 to make the computer model work. But it's worked.
So that's the building at the end of the highway right there, and there it is in reality at the end of the highway. There it is. Kind of makes a kind of extension of the highway. This was this kind of banded skylight that bounced the light back and forth down here. You'll see some of the kind of computerization for that interior space. You'll kind of see why it didn't work. It's just too much money. Didn't have enough money. But the idea of the puzzle piece was the way that we could kind of achieve this relationship with a landscape in a specific way, because we were able to puzzle by making the foundation of the building all out of plywood. But before we actually fixed it, I, with a little Motorola walkie-talkie, drove 4 miles down or 3.5, whatever the limit was, of the highway. And we took like bicycle flags, and I said, okay, move it 10 inches to the left, 2 inches to the right, now push it forward, okay, stop. So we had assembled the entire footprint physically by puzzle piecing this together with this interesting fast forming system. You can see all of these puzzle pieces which locked everything on. Also, it located every single piece of rebar, not just kind of exactly, which helped later. But it took two opposing curved walls and positioned them in the landscape, not just to themselves, but obviously to the subject-object relationship of the highway and of the mountain. Once that was in the position we wanted, then it was inflated with concrete, and that bag form kind of sat there as a like a 30-inch wide, big, beautiful, kind of entrail sausage-like concrete forming system, but very specific. It was nice. But the way we actually made the curvature was to cut apart these prefab forms and then glue them back together. The Big Belt House sits right over the top of that hill right there. And we machined out these benches which would just hold those into exact, this very, very subtle curve. But obviously this curve was mostly so that we could make the building very, very tall and very, very, very slender, but increase the strength of those walls in a very, very large way. Besides that footing, the garage or first floor became a kind of mat footing itself. So and the driveway became a kind of seismic ballast in a strange way. We machined out many components, but on this building it was more of a kind of filtering process. We took prefabricated off-the-shelf parts and then coupled those things with the CNC technology as a way of editing those things. This was an idea that I just wanted to say, okay, how can I just go through Home Depot, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and take that stuff and put it in my machine and have something result. We cut 2-pound density foam again to make these kind of almost like concrete surfboards. They were, they're like the interior walls, very complex foam, but then they were kind of shotcreted with concrete. It's kind of like a drive-it on steroids. Very, very strong. But you can see the relationship in these construction shots. There was also one single tree that I had to we had to move the site back and forth on this sloping hillside to get the relationship just right. The tree is as tall as the building, and there was a huge fire, and thank goodness, because it's its own tree. There was no damage to this. Actually, the fire didn't come this close. But when you drive up the highway and you drive onto the property itself, the tree and the building frame the object of the landscape, which is this kind of dimple and this large mountain that actually holds snow most of the year, almost the whole time. It's not quite glacial. But But the tree and the building frame frame the kind of object of the landscape, and then when you're in the building, it precisely frames the exact same thing by being inside the building itself. So, and as you move around, obviously, that's the only kind of direct, specific relationship, and this will lead into the next project in a way. But the idea that the building continues to have this relationship based on kind of marking and measuring the landscape. This was the elevation which was closest to the highway, so it was very, very private in that regard, but very, very public. Once again, this kind of relationship of framing the tree and the building, framing the object of the landscape, and then ultimately the building inside the building doing the same thing. You can see, I'll move much faster now. This is a view looking the opposite way, where the building sits and negotiates the view off to Mount Edith and this kind of single double tree in a way. And you can see this 6 miles of highway, it turns literally and is eclipsed right at this joint. And then this is the driveway that comes up. The idea was to cast the interior wall / ceiling surfaces out of translucent rubber, but that would have changed the budget from like $160,000 for the whole building, which is what it cost, to like $14 million. So we didn't do that. Hopefully this image kind of brings this to the next project, which is a house for a photographer, a very, very wonderful photographer in New York. I think she's shown here, and she photographs kind of mobile architecture, box cars, containers, these kinds of things. But the notion of the building was to remove itself from the landscape, to, in fact, like the hunter's hat, identify it as something that is in fact alien or not of the landscape, as a way of developing this kind of third relationship to the landscape, you know, first merging, then marking, and then obviously kind of ignoring the landscape as a way of developing this relationship. And I don't have a fourth one. It's just those are the only three I could think of. This house was, in fact, it's a fairly the artist, this photographer is a very interesting woman, and was interested in challenging certain ideas as well. The building is really just a 1,000 square foot kind of concrete cabin retreat that has a curved wall that defines a bedroom. But the bedroom is kind of dropped in as a kind of cocoon in a way, and it goes from a dead flat surface into a kind of arced surface. We experimented with producing a computer model so that we could communicate the concrete work, which we didn't do. We built all the rest of it in Montana and then trucked it to New York. But we had a local basement concrete guy do this, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a great idea. I'll just give him a computer model, and wherever he clips on it, he can find dimensions. And it didn't work either at all, but it was kind of a nice idea. The questioning that we were able to do was to suggest that this is on a very private area, so the notion of privacy, publicity, and exhibitionism could kind of you know, develop its own worth in this place. The notion that the front door and the shower door were exactly equivalent in the building would allow for, if somebody were coming to the house, they would have a choice of either entering the shower or they would enter the front door. There was an obvious kind of kind of critique of this relationship of Mises Barcelona Pavilion relative to this. I thought it would be kind of funny to have the kind of sculpture in a strange way be somebody showering in the building. But I'll go kind of rapidly through this. So from the front door, you can see through to the other front door, which is in fact the shower. And from the bedroom, obviously, you can see the shower. You have to be able to see the shower from the bedroom. I mean, it's a normal piece of program, I guess. You could actually see everything from the bedroom. The bedroom, you can see through the kitchen to the shower. You can see from the living room through to the shower. So every place that you go in this little tiny 1,000 square foot building, you can see the shower, and you can also see through, but you're actually looking kind of above the bedroom. The bed is down here. In this case, you could see this. This was a rubber inset into a concrete sink. This was going to be a great idea, but it also forced the budget to move beyond $100,000, so we didn't do it. But it was the idea that you could just take your sink out and just put it in the dishwasher to clean it. It was nice. It was kind of a liner, kind of safe sink, if you know what I mean. But you could see from outside, through the kitchen, through the bedroom, through the shower to the landscape through this direction right here. That's what we did instead. I won't talk about these puzzle pieces. Could be one thing about this puzzle piece, which is this kind of Douglas fir plywood that so many people detail and try to make it so unpretentious. So it ended up taking a lot of time, but we cut, puzzle pieced all of the plywood in the whole building. But the thing that was really interesting was that it rendered the ceiling and the floor to be very much like surfaces, because it didn't have this kind of typical panel lines. It was more Baroque in a way and kind of odder, maybe more fetishized, but in a strange way, it's like background noise. Because the seam isn't clear and straight, the kind of idea of panelization moves away. There were no doors, obviously, on the building either, and it was just kind of sits, all supported on this cantilever, the shelf, like 40,000 pounds of interior of concrete wall, and it just sits there trying to look a little bit removed and a little bit mobile, and a little bit distinct from that landscape. I'm going to go fast through this. This is a project that I just did in New York. Well, not just did, called PS1. It was a Young Architects competition that I was able to win 2 summers ago. I won't talk about, I'll just kind of move through this. It really was this idea about surface and sensuality. It's kind of 3 words that were hoping to come together to develop an urban beach, which was really what the program was. But it was an urban beach that had to have the theme of Mexico City. It was the Playa Urbana, and that was given to us as a kind of guideline for the competition. And so I won't go into the whole thing, but one of the things that I presented at the final presentation was that I was going to fly to Mexico City. Well, let me back up for 1 second. The idea was that the art and artifacts were being shown inside PS1, which is a contemporary art center in New York City, and the courtyard was our installation, or the place of our installation. And so my idea was that that's an interior idea about Mexico City, so I'm going to develop the exterior idea about Mexico City, which was to fly to Mexico City and, with a handheld global positioning system survey, digitize components, areas of Mexico City as a way of developing this urban beach. Once that happened, it would allow for the project, which is simply just an installation for the summer, to actually be reintroduced to Mexico City as an object, or sorry, as artifact later. So the idea was, it's an installation, it does all of the shit that it's got to do, and then afterwards, what happens is that it's reinstalled in Mexico City, gets sprayed with concrete, and becomes part of the actual fabric of Mexico City. So it is not to be thrown away. The reason I pause on this image is just because Eric Schaefer, who still works with me, I like to torture him by doing this. I'll explain that image in a second. But part of it were these kind of pure quotations of Louis Barragan pools. The actual shallowness of the water, somehow developing this idea of beach. Somehow simply the shallowness being the kind of clearest notion of beach, the kind of resulting idea of beach, and obviously water as being this kind of device, almost filter or lens, which can change color, which is also about this idea of beach. These beautiful pools by Louis Barragan, especially when they're edited, develop this kind of range of color, which is just absolutely fantastic to my mind. And the idea was we would produce these shade structures, which you'll see, but then also these pools with very, very complicated bottoms. And the bottom of the pool would be, very, very kind of beach-like in a strange way, but was mostly to try to develop color, surface to develop color in that respect. And then there was the shading surfaces, which there were surfaces to try to develop shade. And this kind of folds back into the subject-object relationship. Once again, I show this. This is the Evans house that I showed as a little. I'm not showing the whole building, but this is where the PVC was then shot with foam and then concrete to make these surfaces. I did show this during the presentation to suggest that I kind of knew what I was talking about, even though they didn't believe me, of trying to make two-directional curving surfaces out of PVC pipe. But the way I won the competition was that you had MoMA was asking, Museum of Modern Art was asking also that you design a product for warm-up, which is what this whole summer thing was for at PS1. And I had this idea kind of simultaneously, which was to develop something out of one mold that we could produce with my CNC machine. We produce one mold, and then it would produce two things. So we have, obviously, in our installation, we had to have showers, a place for people to take their clothes off and get cool in the summer, because it's for a big party of kind of Gen Xers every Saturday. And then also there's always alcohol served. So I thought, this is great. So I presented this, and I think this is how we won, which was I suggested that we would produce thousands of molds in which soap for the showers would be produced, and then also tequila Jello shots. So that during the party, during these parties, you could shower and eat tequila Jello shots, and potentially based on how many tequila Jello shots you ate, there would be confusion, and then of course that would be the interesting part. I just kind of skipped through the kind of computer work these are the showers, and there were 3 pools and 3 shade spaces. We, like in the Big Belt house, we tested many of these things, and I know Scott Inge is here tonight, a friend of mine who works in Los Angeles and flew to New York, and in 3 days did like 1,800 welds. And he will hopefully back me up about the fact that this thing all snapped together and then was welded very, very rapidly based on the kind of precision of the computer work. We tested it in model like the Big Belt house, but those were our CDs. A great deal of laser cut components. The thing that was this project was really research, and we kind of approached it as research. We weren't just going to try to produce something, we were going to try to extend what we were thinking about, And this to me was the most significant thing, one of the most significant things, besides making it pretty, that we were trying to do, which there's a laser pointer. Which was, well, anyways, what we tried to do is, if you know anything about spline geometry in the computer, if I take that nodal point and that nodal point, and I take both of those and I bend one, then it adjusts all the way along the curve, because it has the designers and the programmers have embedded material qualities. So what we did in software called Rhinoceros, which you guys probably know, we basically changed the spline tool by taking PVC pipe and laying it down on the ground and making a grid out of chalk and photographing it from the roof and bending it to its fracture point and its fractal point. Basically, we just took Schedule 40 PVC pipe and bent it and photographed it and then photoshopped it in an analysis of that, put it back into the computer so that we knew that whatever we could bend, the tool would, whatever we could bend would be something that we could physically produce and replicate in real space with 100% efficiency without having to think at all. So we basically edited the software so that we could produce curvature, which we were sure that we could, because there was no real time for testing these surfaces besides a large model. When we produced these, the large models, they were, obviously, they became the actual project. And these shade spaces were an attempt at taking a tacit attempt at taking basically the idea of the subject of what you would see and the object of what it was supposed to be relative to making shade, and allowing the surface and where people sat and hung out to be the projection plane in which those are my kids. The projection plane in which all of the PVC pipe, the kind of A-B relationship, would project and actually make shade. I BS'd the Museum of Modern Art and said my office was in New York, which was partially true, but then everything else was still in Montana, and so everybody in my office flew back to Montana in our shop, and these were the construction documents for the pools. We built the pools in 10 days, sprayed them with this material called polyurea, which is this incredible stuff, and put them on trucks and then flew back and installed them. And we developed our own kind of fascinating clamping devices by renting equipment and making kind of interesting clamping devices. We just held this foam together with pressure until we sprayed it with a material called polyurea, which is a very, very cool non-VOC, non-off-gassing, intense kind of waterproof polymer. Good UV too. These are just these surfaces. I'll just go through it quickly. These were the showers. This was the lime shade space, which was my favorite of all three of those spaces because of the way, just because of actually its bias in terms of the way the light was to move into that space initially. Obviously, these are the walls of the existing building, the existing courtyard. It's a 40,000 square foot courtyard in which we did this installation. But it was quite nice because there was this translucency about all of this PVC as well, which cordoned off certain space, but also made these shade spaces. And these were the pools. The pools that we produced were this one was about close to 70 feet, and then 30 feet, and then this was. Inside this smaller space was a hot tub, which we didn't produce that. We just coated it with pink polyurea and that was the hot tub. Huge parties of like 6,000 people every Saturday for this warm-up event, and I was just so proud of making pools in 10 days that actually held water. It's really nice, and they were all out of foam, so they were all very, very light. How am I on time? I'm bad. Just a few more things. This is a house I'm doing in Los Angeles, California. I don't want to say this because it'll jinx it, but we're actually, I think building permit. That's all I want to say. Which is a strategy for Brian and Adrian Sipes, which they have a very beautiful mid-century modern house in which effectively, because of certain criteria of fire, certain criteria of side lot lines, all of these things, they couldn't do anything. They went through, I guess, 3 architects and couldn't do anything. And so since we separated the building with 6 feet of space and then made the entrance a separate building and fireproof certain things and all of those things, we're able to actually, I won't even talk about it's got a Corten puzzle piece skin, place this little tube on top of the other building, which basically spans, and so it doesn't have to be, the site doesn't have to be disrupted, and it couldn't be disrupted for certain reasons. It sets down with a column in a courtyard and then another column in the driveway. So this is what's happening in the courtyard here. It's basically just a master bedroom and master bath, which has a small kind of like studio balcony on the back side. And these are a lot of the drawings. Vicky's the red house, the house for photographer. Those were the computer drawings, the computer models that we actually built the building with. We are really trying not to produce images for. We produce models to talk to clients because everybody's so fascinated with the use of the computer. We have a big laser cutter and CNC machine, and so if you can produce a model with incredible efficiency, why not? I mean, I don't understand why keep things in a kind of embryonic stage when you can kind of birth them. I don't get the idea. Anyways, these are all the actual computer models that will generate the structural steel, the stress skin panel infill, and so on. The building sits atop of the other building, and it has a very, very beautiful view of downtown Los Angeles. An installation which didn't work. I'm just going to go this fast, but an interesting idea of deployability, where we tried it was in the Shanghai Biennale, and we tried to take bamboo and just from a starting point and an ending point develop a relationship which was about a very, very complex curvature by taking an indigenous material, 2 indigenous materials, one being bamboo and the other one being day-glow orange zip ties. So these complex kind of combs were to just bend the beginning and ending point of bamboo to develop these surfaces. But the idea was, once again, we were going to do this by doing all the computer work, testing here, and then sending it to be a laser cut in China. The steel was mild. It was supposed to be stainless steel. It didn't work. It was terrible. It was very frustrating, but here's what it was supposed to happen. We labored over these subtle, odd bending moments in here so that what we could do is build everything by hand with no tools, using just steel and zip ties and bamboo. So what we do is bend each one of these pieces of steel, fold them back. So once again, bent, folded back, then another piece to develop further density, attaching the bamboo, and then the zip ties to attempt to develop a new surface and a new entry to the Shanghai Biennale Museum. Didn't work that well. Subject-object relationship. I'm doing a Scott, once again, actually flew out for a day and did the welding on this project, which is called WPS1, which is a radio station an internet radio station that comes online for the Museum of Modern Art sometime in March, I think. But the welding was actually done for this entire project, I believe, in 1 8-hour day. I really won't go into it much, but it is just this slatted orange acrylic and steel. It's really just a little insulation. This project, I think, is only going to be up for a couple years, so that's it. I guess I'll just kind of end with this kind of puzzle piecing. The idea that instead of making a straight cut, we can, and these are some of the puzzles that we've been making, some of the steel that we've been fabricating, and wood and all kinds of things. But the notion of the suggestion that if we can produce material which is edited not for visual reasons, not to make a kind of Baroque shelf bracket, which is the way all of this technology seems to really be used. And I would suggest, even by some people who think that they're experimenting with it in a very sincere way, I still think that it is really very much about the visual and not about the kind of tactile. I am so interested in what was said in that introduction about the idea that I'm much more interested in the light that can be held on surface versus what the surface is itself. For all of the right and maybe all of the wrong reasons too. But we've been experimenting so much with when we bend steel to if we relieve steel in a certain way, we can actually make it go together. We can bend it in ways that other people say we can't do it. We can. The idea that these welds, and I know Scott doesn't want me to show these because of the fact that you know this was just kind of welding triage would be a good term. He was just hammering these things out so that we could try to set a Guinness record or something. But in fact, the thing that was quite nice is that all the pieces, every single piece in all of these projects kind of went together, and then they could just be welded at a certain point so that they would hold back together and develop a certain amount of structural integrity. I've been experimenting at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and doing some testing that in fact, by developing a kind of zipper, a different puzzle piece within these zippers, if I go backwards and I take this puzzle piece and I put it should work. 1 second. Yeah, it goes. If it goes essentially back together, if you take this piece and pull from that piece, because of the complexity of the puzzle, one part pushing on the other part, you can regain 93%. Roughly 90. This is all anecdotal at this point. We're testing it. 93% of its strength. What that means is that instead of cutting two pieces apart, if one cuts it, removes it in a prescribed and kind of rigorous way, then the two pieces can kind of go together with 90% of their strength, at least in one direction. So what does that mean? It means that if you made a straight cut, that this was $1.50 to make that laser cut all the way across here, and this was $1.80 because it's doing that, then for 30 cents you can regain 93% of the strength of the steel. So that's kind of fun. I can't remember the Cronenberg film with the gynecologist that made all those weird dead ringers. I mean, when I look at this, this was a detail for WPS1. This is actually how the puzzle pieces were placed together, and that was so that we could extend We could extend the kind of moment or the bending in that piece. It's like dead ringers. I'm not going to do this anymore. It scares me. Really, it is kind of scary. I'll just fire through the rest of these images because this is just another idea about framing, and this is a project that I'm doing in Connecticut right now for Mark Podolsky, which is this kind of cleft in the building envelope, which the whole building will be lit off of one surface inside from the floor, with this light projected up onto this one surface in this little house, and this house in Wyoming called the Saddle House, and that's it. If you have a question? Yeah.
The wall that you illustrated at the beginning of the lecture, you said that it had a greater strength in several directions. Would that be a viable wall or a power building?
There's a good friend and structural engineer sitting right over here, so I would almost defer that question, but the answer anecdotally would be yes. I mean, if you can take a piece of steel and by punching it, bend it in two directions, diaphragmatically, as well as, even in compression, obviously you can get something to resist load. If I take this piece of paper and I push it like this, then if I bend it this direction, I push down, I can support so much more load. So it's just, the answer to me is yes. Have I done it? I don't know. But yeah. Thanks a lot.